Uachtarán, a cógáil G Vermagin. Agus mar dúirt an Uachtarán is ocáid the creidte é seo. I think the President has summed up very eloquently in our opening remarks how unique and how extraordinary today's event is. And I suppose really one of the key issues that we have to talk about today under the topic of education is the whole shift to remote teaching and learning. As the President has indicated in the running order for the day, that will come later on in the afternoon. What I am going to do now is what I traditionally each year at convention have the pleasure of doing, and that is providing an opening the education section of the report of the convention in this instance, and providing an overview of some of the main issues that have been happening in education since we met last in April of 2019. And of course, the Education Committee will also give commentary on its report initiated by the Chairperson, Anne Loughnane. So, President, I'm going to kind of give an overview of not so much what has been happening in education since last convention, but rather what are the issues that the ASTI has prioritised in our work on the NCCA and with the Department of Education and with the various agencies which are so instrumental in providing education services. So looking at curriculum first, I think one of the very big achievements that the ASTI has had a special role in has been in securing the status of history within the junior cycle framework. The Minister for Education finally, after much, shall we say, sustained and engaged lobbying and discussion, and particularly through the NCC, through our representatives in the History Teachers Association and in the NCCA, the history is now designated as a special core status within the junior cycle framework. And one of the tasks of the NCCA right now is to go and devise, shall we say, how does that fit in now into the framework, and that work is ongoing. Speaking of the junior cycle, one of the other issues of concern to the ASTI is the fact that it's only very recently in this year, and of course we are all aware of the delays and all issues, but nonetheless, only very recently has the tender been issued for the review of the junior cycle. You will recall that one of the key commitments in the joint statement following the framework of the junior cycle was a commitment to a longitudinal review of the experience of and the implementation of the junior cycle framework. Regrettably, this will not be a longitudinal study, and that is something which the ASTI remains very agitated about. On the senior cycle, when there's a lot of issues happening there, so what we have planned to do is after the Education Committee report is provided, I will give an update on where we're at with the senior cycle, and there will also be space for delegates to engage with those issues. One of the biggest debates that we had at convention last year had to do with the topic of inclusive education. It really was probably one of the most important debates we've had for a very long time. We passed two incredibly important motions, which I'll address in a moment. But I think it's very important to give an indication to the delegates of where we are at with inclusive education. One of the big events for myself as an official of the union and for the President and for other stakeholders in education was earlier this year, the National Council for Special Education published its policy advice to the Minister for Education on inclusive education. The context for this advice is very significant and it will not go away. So I think we need to be very careful around how we engage with this emerging policy debate. And that context is the fact that in 2018, the Government of Ireland ratified Article 24.2 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And that section 24.2 obliges states to ensure that children can access an inclusive, quality and free education on an equal basis with others in the communities in which they live. So following that ratification by the Irish government, the National Council for Special Education was tasked with developing a policy to meet those obligations, and it emerged with a policy which very quickly became entitled the New Brunswick Policy. And essentially it said that if education is to be absolutely inclusive, it means that one school must meet the needs of all pupils. Now, in Ireland, we're in an extraordinary position as regards inclusive education. And I'm quoting very, very accurate statistics. 98% of our students with special educational needs are educated in mainstream schools. That's quite extraordinary. I was at an event the other day with our incoming president, Anne Piggott, a global event on inclusive education. And in most countries in the world, the percentage of special SEN students educated in mainstream schools falls below 10% in some instances. We are in this situation since the Education for Persons with Special Educational Needs Act, the EPSIN Act, since 2004, that 98% of our students are educated in mainstream schools. A truly extraordinary phenomenon. And that has not been an easy journey for teachers. We have been resource poor, and while we have had a much better resource allocation model in recent years, not everything is as we would like it to be. One of the big issues that the ASTI had with the new resource allocation model was the fact that yes, we welcome the fact that additional resources are being made available to schools without having to go through assessment of each individual students. But the problem was there was no actual training for either those teachers who are now termed SET, special education teachers, and neither was there training for the mainstream teachers. So we have this typical Irish phenomenon in very many ways where we adopt the principle, schools are expected to deliver on it, but the training is not provided. And then one of the other major issues which we had was the fact that the circular which the Department of Education issued to support the new allocation model very, very clearly stated, and it's an absolutely disgraceful statement, very clearly stated that the resources to be dedicated to the coordination of special educational needs in schools should be kept to a minimum. To me, this is to me, and indeed to you, more to the point, to you, the teachers, to the standing committee, this is an absolutely invidious situation. So last year at convention, you'll recall, we passed motion 21 demanding that each school would have a coordinator with special educational needs, and motion 71 for the coordinator, and motion 81 that a national training program would be put in place. The ASTI officers and officials have engaged with the Department of Education in several meetings promoting this agenda. We were getting very close to actually getting some form of an accommodation when the COVID crisis hit us. And in a way, these issues have been put on hold. But I can assure you, delegates, they are not going to be put on hold once we return to school, because one of the biggest, I suppose, public concerns about the impact of the school closure has been on the needs of students with special education. And I think it is a very appropriate time for the ASTI to re-engage with the department on these issues. So, and also may I just maybe perhaps finish on the whole area of inclusive education. Last week, unfortunately, our president wasn't able to be with us, was at other meetings, but last week the Deputy General Secretary, Dermot Dupere, and I met with the new Minister of State, Josepha Madigan, for special educational needs and inclusion. We were very frank with her. We were absolutely explicit about the need for progress on the ASTI motions, and we were absolutely explicit on the need for her to be up and running with her brief. So we are in head office, we are ready to move very, very rapidly in this whole area. So President, I'm going to move on then to talk about I suppose another area of neglected policy, which the ASTI has been doing very, very good work and very, I suppose, behind the scenes work. It hasn't really hit the headlines, but I think it's very important, delegates, that you are aware of it. That is the whole area of, and the Equality Committee, which unfortunately is not in a position to give its report today. I know they have been doing quite a lot of work in the whole area of inclusive schools, particularly with regard to our Traveller and Roma minority. Delegates, it pains me to say this, and I think it pains all of us who have the interests of children at heart. 13% of Traveller children complete second level education. That's quite extraordinary. 13%, 1% proceed to third level education. Last year, 2019, the European Commission report on racism and intolerance did a major report on the situation of the traveller and Roma community in Ireland. One of the key policy points it made was the need for more investment in education for traveller children. In particular, it called for the establishment of community supports for traveller children to support their attendance, their progression, and their completion, and of course their achievement in education. And the kind of community support that they're talking about is exactly the support that was abolished and never replaced our visiting teacher service, which was doing such sterling work in engaging with traveller families, traveller mothers, traveller communities to make sure that the school was valued, that children were sent to school, that children were supported at school. So I think one of the really big issues for the ASTI into the future is to seek the re-establishment of that dedicated service. I think it's also important to reference the fact for delegates that it's not just about international recommendations concerning the need for us to do right by our traveller and Roma children. We also now have, going through its final stages in Shannon Éireann, a bill initiated in 2018 called the Bill on Traveller Culture and History in the Curriculum. And this bill has all-round support and will very shortly be passed, no doubt. And what it will require is that the curriculum, and not just the curriculum as in the text, but rather the realisation of that curriculum in the classroom and in the schools, will become part of the mainstream curriculum in the primary and second level schools. So I really do think it's a very, very appropriate time for the ASTI, not just to make a stand on the basis of the rights of traveller children to education, but also on the need for schools to be supported to become the truly inclusive school that all of you wish your schools to be. Moving on then to one area of education policy where I have to say I have to give credit to the Department of Education to some degree, and that has been the policy den educas na Gaeltacht na Háit na Gaeltacht. I have had the privilege of representing the ASTI on the steering committee, which is overseeing the implementation of this ambitious policy from the policy frames from a 5-year period from 2017 to 2022. It is very, very explicitly located on the basis of the very increasingly complex socio-linguistic situation in the Gaeltacht areas, whereby the number of people who speak Irish at home on a daily basis is actually in consistent I was going to say retreat, but is diminishing in a very consistent manner. And the ambitious policy of the Department of Education, which is quite well supported in terms of training, in terms of additional resources for schools, in terms of additional teachers for schools, in terms of coherent training for school leadership, to me is a model of how we should do change in education. So just b'while marad and a moonshire tá gobar ins na skellen na shin, my shiv tá na tuarishki ar fara tá I chock the rash, tá she bra sellier go will shiv galer a gobar go crua, agus will shiv ag ban salt fresh and ass on as an scéim nua seo, agus ag fólam alán fuad féin agus na daltaigh agus an ceantar na bhfuil sibh ag obair agus ag múnú. President, I want to move on to 2 last items before we move to the Education Committee. One of the, I suppose, when we as trade unionists look at our global situation, we are incredibly aware, sometimes comfortably, sometimes uncomfortably, of how much Irish education policy is shaped by global reports and by global rankings. Of course, we have to be very critical. Sometimes these rankings can be very instrumental, cannot take on board the fundamental values and principles with which we imbue education and with which we imbue our teaching, and which teachers by definition wish to advocate. But at the same time, I think, to paraphrase the concept of the incidental inspection, they do give a good snapshot at a moment in time of how the education system is performing for its own students, but also at a global level. So I'm happy to convey, President, some of the good news from an OECD policy paper which was produced in June, just some weeks ago, got completely overlooked naturally in the concerns around the return to school and the whole issue of predicted grading and the Leaving Cert examination. But the OECD Education Policy Outlook, which we will put up a link to on our website so you can look at 2020, made the following key points about the Irish second level education system. It acknowledged that we are consistently performing significantly above the OECD average in reading, mathematics and science according to PISA, the results of PISA 2018. Much more important than that, as you well know, achievement and grades are one thing. It is the quality of our schools that's equally important. And PISA 2018 found that Irish schools are more socially inclusive than most other countries in the OECD. For example, how do we know that? For example, the variation in reading performance between schools in Ireland. So whether you're talking about the school in St. Gaeltacht, no, the school in a Jesh school, no, a school in a suburb or elsewhere in the country. The variation in reading performance between schools in Ireland is 11%. The average variation in the OECD is 29%. Now that commitment to an inclusive and quality education did not come about by policy. It came about because of the work that you do in the classroom. So my shiv. Moreover, I think a very, very important dimension of education an important dimension of equity in our schools is the achievement gaps between students with immigrant backgrounds and native-born students. In Ireland, the variation in reading performance between the native-born students and the immigrant students is 9%. In the OECD, it's 24%. Again, I think it is time for an accolade. I think that is one of the unsung success stories of the Irish experience since 2002, when our country opened up to, one would always say, mass migration. Our schools really were the front line of that mass migration. And look at what a job you've done. We have one of the lowest variations in performance between immigrant students and native students in the entire OECD. However, the OECD report did go on to identify a number of key policy challenges for Irish education. And as we know, when the OECD makes these identifications, our Chief Inspector, our Minister for Education, our politicians, and all of the voices which are engaged in shaping the discourse around education listen very carefully, and of course we should too. So the key challenges that they are identifying are how to raise outcomes for all. And that, I think, is one of the key global messages we're now hearing in education, particularly in the context of the pandemic. How do we raise outcomes for all? One of the ways the OECD advocates that we need to raise outcomes for all, we need more supports to disadvantaged students. And this has been a very, very consistent mantra of the ASTI for a very long time. Of course, we support the policy of JESH, targeted intervention in areas of greatest need. But we also need now to move away from the focus exclusively on the concentration to looking at the needs of individual students in different contexts. And the OECD explicitly makes that point, that we need more supports to individual students who are not in the JESH and targeted areas. One of the other key policy challenges which the OECD has identified, and of course it's absolutely going to come up when we talk about the senior cycle, and particularly in the context of the very ambitious and far-reaching further education strategy launched last week by Minister Harris, and that is the need for wider pathways at senior cycle to ensure that there is better pathways post-school into further education, into apprenticeships, into on-the-job training, as well as to higher education. So to me, when I read that statement, we are very much talking about pressures building up around changes in the senior cycle curriculum, and we need to be very, very aware of that. And of course, one of the other key policy recommendations from the OECD in this June report was the need for the school system to respond to diversity. It did mention the fact of the patronage issue and the ownership of schools, which is one dimension of diversity. But of course, the big dimension of diversity is education for all. Our migrant students, our LGBT plus students, our students with special educational needs, our students from the traveller and Roma communities, our students in direct provision. Schools must respond to diversity, and I think this is one of the biggest societal challenges which we have ahead, and which schools, of course, have a key role to play. And finally, I want to conclude, President, by saying these are extraordinary challenges. Irish teachers and our school system has demonstrated we're well capable of responding in a very professional manner to challenges, but we're not being helped. As you yourself said, President, in your introductory remarks, the latest OECD report, Education at a Glance, which gives an overview of investment in education across the OECD countries, listed Ireland last out of 35 countries in terms of investment in second level education as a percentage of GDP. Currently, in 2019, the figures for 2019, 2017 would have been assembled in, 1.2% of Irish GDP is spent on second level education, compared to an OECD average of 2% and an EU average of 1.9%. So it's rather, I suppose, in a way, depressing in one way that this has been one of the key objectives of the ASTI, that we have adequate investment in education. And yet, indeed, even as we were coming out of austerity, we are slipping down the international rankings on probably one of the most important strategic investments any government can make, which is investment in education. So, President, I know I've gone on a little, but I think it's probably very important that delegates are getting a flavour of what are the issues, of what we have been engaging in, what we need to continue to engage in, particularly when we're not in a room for 3 days where we can discuss and debate and critique all of the issues that are going on. So I'll conclude on that, but before I do, may I just say I want to thank the Education Committee, in particular the work of Anne Loughnane in steering us all. It's always, I love my Education Committee. We always have good, robust debates. We keep it within the confines of education, which can be a very safe and enjoyable space sometimes. And I just want to say, in fairness to many of our Education Committee, now you're going to see some videoed recordings from four members of the Education Committee. As you know, there are 9 members on the Education Committee. Unfortunately, due to illness, family circumstances and absence from home today, those remaining 5 members could not engage with recording, and some of them are not able to join us today. But I don't think that is in any way an indication of their work and the collective work that goes on at the Education Committee. So I just want to say thank you, Gachtainna. Agus Garamaira Uachtarán, agus by me rash leis on chastas so and or chastas.
Thank you. Thank you, Moira, for that insightful and, I have to say, at times frightening report. But I want to come back again. By nature, I'm a positive person, and to congratulate and give the cogordagus to all our teachers to have achieved those results that Moira recounted to us there in terms of inclusive society. And remember, we are a republic, and that's, very important to us. That we are also a country, of course, we have to remember, where our people went abroad to look for a livelihood. So it is wonderful results, Moira, that you have recounted there, and congratulations, and double congratulations, because this has been done against a backdrop of huge underfunding, and we cannot emphasize that enough. And with that, I would ask for the committee members who have already recorded, please. So if you would give us those. Thank you very much.
Anne Loughnane, Carbery Branch CEC and Chairperson of the Education Committee, proposing the Education Report. I wish to highlight a few of the many issues that Education Committee has researched during the past year and their impact on second level education. Change in senior cycle is the juggernaut that is hurtling in our direction. As we try to hold our equilibrium in the face of this change, it is important to be aware of the broader educational context. As has often happened in the past, teachers are now expected to do the impossible with little, if any, consideration given to the impact this has on our lives and our health. We're acknowledged as stakeholders in education, yet very often this sounds like lip service. We cannot allow the chronic underfunding of education in Ireland to continue, as more and more is demanded of us. The evidence is there and it is stark. In the 2018 Education at a Glance report from the OECD, Ireland ranked last out of 34 countries for investment in education as a percentage of GDP. Ireland invests 1.2% of GDP in education, compared to an OECD average of 2% and an EU average of 1.9%. This simply must change before any revised curriculum is introduced at senior cycle. We're professionals, not magicians. The Leaving Certificate is and will continue to be a high-stakes examination. On this occasion, we cannot allow our voices to be marginalised and disregarded, as happened with junior cycle reform. Let us bear in mind that those who do not learn from the mistakes of the past are destined to repeat them. The many mistakes that were made with the junior cycle can be avoided as we embark on revising the senior cycle. If the Department of Education and NCCA are wise, they will have learned from past errors and will proceed in a more genuinely collaborative manner. In such a scenario, the senior cycle can be a welcome opportunity to improve on and refashion the existing Leaving Certificate. The long-standing strengths of the Leaving Certificate are widely acknowledged. It's an external, impartial and transparent system. It enjoys a high level of public trust and is highly regarded internationally. The Education Committee expressed its support for a number of changes at senior cycle, including the need to develop pathways to further education and training, separate to the universities and third-level colleges. Senior cycle must be far broader than just a means to accumulate sufficient points for entry to particular university and college courses. We in the Education Committee support the focus on student well-being, and we contend that if the Department of Education and NCCA are serious about the well-being of students, then a greatly improved guidance and counselling provision must be made available to all students. Needless to say, this will require increased funding. However, substantial short, medium and long-term benefits will accrue from such expenditure. The senior cycle must afford equal opportunities to all students, irrespective of their economic or cultural background, to access and achieve their chosen career paths. Any possibility of outside intervention where further advantage would accrue to the already advantaged must be avoided. We in the Education Committee support a standalone transition year that is available and accessible to all students. In transition year, students are given the opportunity for personal growth while experiencing a wide variety of activities, including vocational learning and work experience. Although we have researched and considered possible developments in a new senior cycle programme, the Education Committee strongly believes that it would be unacceptable to proceed with the senior cycle prior to a full review of the junior cycle, which was first introduced in September 2014 in a subject-specific incremental manner. The Department of Education committed to such a review in 2016, yet 4 years later it has not begun. Instead, the NCCA initiated a review of the senior cycle through the ESRI. The review was conducted in 41 schools, referred to usually as the network schools. Dr. Brian Fleming's report for the ASTI on the consultative process employed in this review is an interesting and cautionary read. Unfortunately, Dr. Fleming's findings do not bode well for the hope of a genuinely collaborative approach, as he concludes the process has been of doubtful value. He was critical of the fact that in the 41 network schools, not all teachers were involved in the consultation. He also questioned why only 1 of 11 questions posed to the participants referred to the junior cycle reform experience. Thirdly, he noted the total absence of any reference to implementation issues. Delegates, it is clear that we need to remain wary and watchful of developments relating to the senior cycle. In conclusion, as I depart from the Education Committee, I would like to sincerely thank Eileen and Moira from Head Office, who provide ongoing support for the work of the committee. In addition, I thank the President and Vice President for their attendance and valued contributions to our meetings. Finally, I want to pay a particular tribute to my colleagues on the Education Committee, who always give generously of their time, their energy and their opinions. It's been a pleasure to work with you all, and I wish you well. Thank you.
Speaker, please, from the Education Committee.
Seamus Keane, Fingal CEC Education Committee, speaking today on junior cycle reform and wellbeing. In a 2012 interview with Dublin City FM, Rory Quinn stated that when students go for an interview after leaving university, the employer asks about what else the student did. Were they involved in sport? Did they display leadership qualities or star in Joseph and his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat? The minister went on to say, what we are trying to do is align that kind of labour market interviewing thresholds with what happens in the school. And numerous employers and captains of industry are saying that people coming out of the present education system may have a wonderful set of qualifications, but in reality, they don't have the necessary skills to enable them to communicate their learning, to engage in dialogue, to make presentations, or to work collectively with other people. The rationale for reform was that traditional direct teaching, where teachers who are experts in their subjects help students navigate and understand the knowledge that is required to become competent in that subject, is not fit for the 21st century. Teachers must now embrace the child-centred inquiry and discovery-led ideology, which posits that the child's innate curiosity just needs to be nurtured by the teacher to allow them to come by the knowledge themselves. Of more importance than mere knowledge are the mythical 21st century skills, because in the age of Google, who needs to learn anything? It's becoming a cliche, but still deserves repeating. Teachers are effectively being shifted from the sage on the stage to guide on the side to peer at the rear, and knowledge is continuously debased as rote learning. Teachers are now meant to be curriculum creators, creating bespoke courses from the suite of learning outcomes. They must refrain from teaching and constantly create opportunities for students to self-discover, preferably in groups. At the recent NCCA Junior Cycle Early Enactment Review of English, the majority of teachers present were frustrated at the amount of work that is now required of them and demanded teacher guidelines and a proper curriculum. The participants also voiced their concerns at how the junior cycle is reducing texts to mere vehicles for key skills such as communicating, working with others, and managing information by being curious. The technocrats seem to have no appreciation for the richness of texts and the absolute pleasure inherent in bringing a group of students along on a textual journey. The advice is to get through text quickly, focusing on key moments, openings and closings, facilitate group work and the student voice, and move on to the next text, or preferably infographic. Other concerns raised at the review included the loss of subject teaching time to facilitate well-being, as English goes from its traditional 5 periods a week to 4. There seems to be little cognizance of teachers' well-being, as we are being forced to take on more class groups as the subject contact time with each group is reduced. The wellbeing guidelines explicitly state the new subject specification for junior cycle requires less time than previous syllabi, 240 hours for Gaeilge, English and Maths, and 200 hours for all other subjects. One consequence of this will be an increase in the time available for learning in wellbeing. Firstly, we know there is actually more content in the new specifications than in the old course. More content wouldn't in itself be a problem if the time had increased or at least remained the same. The 400 hours for well-being is nothing more than cynical posturing by a government desperate to be seen to be doing something about youth mental health and mental health in general. Rather than supporting the well-being of our young people, this is an attack on their well-being. Disadvantaged students will bear the brunt of reduced instruction time. They'll fall further behind, grow more disaffected, and be less able to compete with their affluent peers when it comes to entry to third level unemployment.
Thank you, Seamus. So could we have the next speaker, please, from the Education Committee?
President, Vice President, Delegates, Idal Farrell, Cork South, Paddy Mulcahy Branch, CEC and Education Committee. Over the past few months, our style and approach to learning and teaching changed drastically. On March 13th, we stepped up to the challenge, and overnight we relocated our classrooms to our kitchens, sitting rooms, back gardens, and some even to our cars. Without hesitation, we adapted quickly to ensure we could continue to deliver lessons to the best of our ability. Conversations with colleagues revolved around what type of digital platform we were using to interact with and educate our students. We spoke about Microsoft Teams, Google Classroom, Screencastify, Zoom, to name but a few. Ironically, the shortened commute actually resulted in us working longer hours and our workload increased dramatically. Subject material had to be digitally prepared, worksheets and PowerPoints were created, recordings and podcasts were made. We had to ensure we continued to differentiate material, meet our learning outcomes and address the key skills, while also cooking, cleaning, parenting, homeschooling and caring for older relatives. Over 4,000 of us engaged with the ASTI survey on remote teaching, where results highlighted that teachers were presented with many challenges. Some of us had to use our own personal devices to prepare content, others had to contend with poor broadband connection, while almost all of us found ourselves working harder than ever. We all received work from students late into the night and sometimes the early morning. However, despite this, we continued to be motivated and dedicated. Many of us took it upon ourselves to upskill in our own time, and that was when we found time. And I'm sure you'd all agree that over the last few months, we all gained an unofficial qualification as teachers of ICT. We may be in a digital age, but what has become very apparent is that a significant number of our students struggled greatly when asked to upload, download, attach, or save material, and that in fact, digital literacy is a huge issue. Not only were we teaching our subject content, but we also had to teach students how to use the various digital platforms. In a digital age where students are considered to be tech savvy, some lacked the basic skills in ICT, and in fact, we adapted better than they did. Remote teaching had its downfalls and created mitigated disadvantages. A number of students did not have access to technology or broadband. For some, it resulted in non-engagement, online attendance was poor, and in the long term, we'll find ourselves having to reteach some of the content on our returns to school. In 2015, the then Minister of Education, Jan O'Sullivan, invested 210 million in digital strategy for schools. She requested that over the 5-year period, she wanted teachers to use technology in the classroom to bring learning to life for the students. We've certainly fulfilled this task in the last 3-month period, but probably not in the way that she intended it to be implemented. Technology is a tool for learning and not a requirement for teaching. Remote teaching is in no way as beneficial as face-to-face interaction in the classroom. 2 of the key priorities in the Digital Strategy Action Plan are to provide information to teachers on innovative ways to use digital technologies more effectively in our teaching and to enhance access to and impact of CPD for teachers through extending CPD delivery formats. How many of us have received such information or have even been in receipt of this CPD? A document entitled Digital Learning 2020, Reporting on Practice in Early Learning and Care, Primary and Post-Primary Contexts, published on June 26th, highlighted that teacher confidence and CPD are key factors in embedding digital technologies in learning. A number of us have not afforded the opportunity to engage with such CPD, nor do we have the time to, with all of our other new initiatives we're expected to engage with. We need to make sure that protocols relating to remote teaching are put in place and adequate training is afforded to teachers if we're expected to deliver lessons remotely in the future. Thanks, delegates.
Much. And we have another speaker from the Education Committee, please.
I'm Pauline Nagel. I am CEC Clare Branch. I'm also chemistry representative on the NCCA, and I am a member of the Education Committee. I'm just going to give you a quick update on what's happening with the NCCA Senior Cycle Sciences at any rate. We've had no meeting since early in March. We have had issues with the NCCA with regard to the new specifications. Promised that the union representatives will meet, and she was organising that just prior to the lockdown. So hopefully, as soon as lockdown is finished, we will be, all the representatives from the senior sciences will be meeting. I also hope that the representatives on the Teaching Council will ask for verification and for the research that's involved, that has been involved for these new specifications. I certainly do not wish to have courses or specifications that are in any way similar to the junior cycle. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pauline. Right, that is the number of recorded speakers we have, but I'd ask, throw it open to the floor, so to speak, or out there into cyberspace. If somebody wishes to speak to the report, please send in your name. We have a couple of questions on the report, and Moira will deal with those.
Yeah, Maura, you might be at a disadvantage there. The first question came in from Joe Daly. What action is proposed to reverse the cuts to traveller and SEN supports, which went through without serious opposition from the ASTI? That was the question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Joe. I think it's a very legitimate question to ask. I think we have to recall, if we can recall, my goodness, we've been through 2 crises in our recent professional and private and social lives. One was the extraordinary austerity cuts of the budget of December 2008 and March 2009, which absolutely decimated the education system. And of course, now we're in this crisis. The impact of the cuts in education 10, 11 years ago continue to be felt. Not only were services such as the visiting teacher service for travellers, aspects of home tuition, etc., decimated. The pupil-teacher ratio was, since that period, raised on 2 occasions. We now have a pupil-teacher ratio which we had in the 1970s. Also, we had cuts to teacher salary. We had impositions giving inferior and unequal salaries to new teachers. So I think really, if we look at the broad context of what the ASTI as a political organisation, as a trade union, has to engage with, I think we have actually done an enormous service as regards the supports which our most disadvantaged students needs. And they are indeed the traveller students and the students of special educational needs. I think one of the really big lessons that I have certainly learned by being involved with a lot of what I would call social policy areas on behalf of the ASTI is that practically all of society, and certainly the civil society agencies such as Barnardo's, the Children's Rights Alliance, Alone, you name it, all of these agencies who work with marginalised and disadvantaged young people. They look to the teacher unions for leadership, for advocacy, to speak up for their children, to make sure that they get the best possible start in education. And I think it's fair to the ASTI to say that we have not forgotten the SEN students or the Roma or the traveller students. Every opportunity that we get, and I have to say, in our democratic state, they are many. Every opportunity that we get to engage with the Oireachtas, with the joint Oireachtas Committee on Education and Skills, with individual bilateral meetings with politicians, with ministers, with senior officials in the Department of Education, in TUSLA, etc., etc. We are raising this issue of the need to restore, to reinstitute the visiting teacher service for travellers. I have to say I have a particular issue around the way we are treating travellers in education. We have a very, very marginalised community who only 2 years ago were deemed to have an official ethnic minority status in the Irish state. And yet we are bringing them into school and we are treating traveller children as if they are mainstream students with just certain additional needs. I think we have to rethink the way we engage with minorities in our school system. I am not saying that teachers are not doing a great job. You are doing an amazing job, but the system is not supporting you to do the type of job you need. So yes, I absolutely agree. We need to restore the visiting teaching service for travellers, because we all know for students who are struggling with school, with the culture of school, with lack of support from families, one of the most vital supports they can get is like the homeschool liaison, is like the visiting teacher service. Teachers, professionals who go to their home, who build up the capacity to support that child through education. So we are on that page. And again, it is very much regretful, given the truncated agenda we have today, that the Equality Committee cannot come in at this point. They have been doing really important work in this area. So I think you can rest assured that you can feel the passion that we have here in head office about these issues. And we are very, very conscious that this concept of an inclusive school will only be cant if we don't take into account the needs of the most disadvantaged and the most minority of groups. So I'd like then to move on to the second question, which of course we'll come back to later on.
I'll give the...
Oh, sorry, excuse me.
No, there are three questions there, President, that are more relevant rather than to the education report. They're more relevant to the contribution I'll be making later this afternoon in relation to the return to school business. So I would happily take all three of them as
okay, I only know two
as a
anyway.
job lot. Anyway.
Okay.
If that's helpful, President.
Right, well, I'll give the questions that have come in. So the first one is from Ian McLaughlin, and it is McColgan, I beg your pardon. Will the department provide all teachers with a laptop to facilitate remote teaching and learning?
Well, actually, there are two other questions there on the
Will I give them all
if you would actually,
yeah,
because
okay.
the answer is framed, I'll have to frame my
Right.
answer around all three of them actually.
Fine, so the next one is Barbara Smith. And does the NCCA still intend to roll out the new specifications for for LCA this September in English and Communications, Maths, ICT, or will this be put on hold? And Pádraig Mac, I don't know which Mac it is, but anyway, that's what this person identifies themselves as. Any update on the new Leaving Certificate Art curriculum being introduced in September? Teachers have not been given proper in-service and are unsure regarding the situation with regard to course content, etc.
Okay, President, look, I think I can deal with all. The first question is very different than the other two, but I'll just deal with Ian's question first. I will be making a more substantial contribution this afternoon in relation to the reopening of schools and updating convention of what's going on in relation to that to the extent that I can. And to the extent that I can is the situation, as you know, the commitment very much in the last 24, 48 hours in the media has been that the substantial announcements around all the areas associated with the reopening of schools will take place next week. And what I can say for our part, and these three questions are to some extent stealing the thunder a little bit of what I intended to say, but I will deal with it now. First of all, in relation to the providing of a laptop to facilitate remote teaching and learning, we and the department have been at somewhat different perspectives in relation to that, both publicly and privately, in that the department have been arguing for the full return of everyone to school. And we've been skeptical in relation to that, in relation to being capable of managing that process in a manner that would be socially distant and all the rest of it. So there has been that tension there. And really what we've been doing is putting it up to the department to prove to us that it is possible for a full return. So that's over to them. But in relation to Ian's question, the logic follows that if it is their view that everybody is back, they wouldn't see a need to provide teachers with a laptop to facilitate remote learning. So it's something that we've been in one space and they've been in another in relation to, and we will have to see how that transacts in the coming weeks. With regard to Barbara's and Pádraig's questions in relation to what essentially amounts to initiative overload, because we've had too much of that in recent years, we have been emphatic at the discussions with the department that all the new specifications and so on, that this must be paused. It is just too much to load and pile all of that extra endeavour and work upon the system, which will, when it reopens, will be creaking at the seams in many ways anyway. I have some optimism in the sense that we've definitely been heard. Whether or not they will act upon it remains to be seen, probably next week. But certainly we have been making exactly the cases that both Pádraig and Barbara have been making in their questions, and we will see how that pans out. I expect sooner rather than later.
Yes, and if I may add to that, indeed we have been very robust in our seeking to properly resource the education and the challenges that will lay ahead. And one of the issues, apart from whether we go back, as the General Secretary has pointed out, in a situation which has the social distancing that's required in line with NEFIT, etc. But we also must have the capacity that if there is an outbreak where we have to move to remote learning, which is a very real possibility in the autumn or winter, whether it be nationwide or whether it be a specific cohort from a school or whatever, that those people will have it. So these questions are very pertinent.
President, just on my screen here, there are two other matters arising there, and I'm going to suggest that we deal them in reverse order. We have another question in there from Michelle Ryan, and she's asking, was there any consultation with the union before removing SEN from the DES to the Department of Inclusion? And there's a very simple answer to that question: no, there was none. And we have a member of convention, President. This will be the first time we'll see how this transacts. A member of convention, Susie Hall, who wishes to speak briefly to the education report. So
okay,
over
so
to our
Susie,
technical people
please.
to
and I hope your broadband holds up there, Susie, from West Cork. Calling West Cork. Have you got,
yes,
you need to put on your
Susie's
camera
listening.
apparently,
Yeah.
Susie.
I beg your pardon. I'm coming to grips with technology. And I didn't intend to speak to this section at all, and it is a superb report. And congratulations to the Education Committee and indeed the head office staff and everybody. But there's one group who are very close to my heart, and I haven't heard them mentioned, and I would like their needs in some way stitched into the record. When I retired from teaching some 10 years ago, I signed up as a volunteer with Focus Ireland. And I go round to 2 or 3 schools every week when schools are open, and I speak to students about homelessness. In that work, I always ask the teacher before I go there, are there any students who are homeless or threatened with homelessness? At the start, it was a rare thing. It was really a rare thing to find that there were students in the school who were homeless or who were threatened with homelessness. Sadly, I have to tell you now that I rarely visit a school where students in the class are not homeless. It's really quite a shocking thing. And these children are expected to, do homework on an upturned suitcase in some hotel room with the whole rest of their family living there and the baby screaming and everything else. I do not know how these children are managing. It's really an appalling situation. And of course, they have the added stress of their parents upset at being homeless and the just lack of any kind of certainty in their lives. And I would appeal to the Education Committee to make the homeless students, who are now a considerable cohort within our second level education system, and indeed in the primary system too, but our concern has to be with our second level students, and we have to represent them and their interests. And I would appeal to the Education Committee to include homeless students in their deliberations with the Department of Education. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Susie. And I see we have another, I'm just waiting for it to come up on my screen here, please.
If I could be helpful there,
yeah,
President.
So a question comes in here. So it's from Helen O'Reilly. So a question read, the reopening of schools. Is there any information on the deadline for the leaving certificate? Oh, we've gone blank. So we'll just have to wait a moment. Right, I think we're back. The joys of technology. So I'll recap. So reopening of schools. Is there any information on if the deadline for the Leaving Certificate Food Studies Journal will be extended? The current deadline for the Leaving Certificate 2021 is the 3rd of November 2020. With school closures, most students will not have cooked the required 4 dishes in 5th year, as it would normally be the case. Social distancing will make practical classes more challenging this coming year.
Yeah, and look, I see there's a second question, if I may be so bold, President. From
Yeah, I
Sandra
can't see
Fay
that.
there.
So.
Even if we do return and cluster breaks out, schools will shut,
Oh,
and
yes.
remote learning will be required for these schools, so will laptops be provided. We've been making that point, Sandra, and convention, I should say. And we've been also following up on the point that Helen is making, and it is being considered. It's not as if the matter is not being considered within the department. What we don't have is the response yet. But you can rest assured, convention, and I know we've strayed quite a bit from Moira's work and her education report there, but you can rest assured that those matters have been raised, and we will await next week's announcements and the weeks after that in relation to these questions.
Right, and there are some obviously that are relevant to the NCCA work as well, because there is consultation going on between the NCCA and the department and the SEC, State Examinations Commission, and the department, particularly around those examination classes for the next academic year.
Okay, President, I'm noticing there on my screen now.
All right, there's a request to speak.
Speak from Mark Walsh there.
So,
can we bring Mark in?
Yes, please.
And just for speakers as well, if they wish, they would put on their camera, and I understand that we will see them as well as hear them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, Mark, we can hear
by
you.
The way,
we
Mark,
can't see you, but...
By the way, Mark, before you start, the time to speak to a report is 3 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay. You can see me, yeah? Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks, Mark. We can see you too. Yeah.
Yeah, just to respond to one or two issues in the education report. The first thing is the reference to training for special needs education. And I think we have emphasized the need for training for teachers, but also what I think wasn't mentioned was the need for time, because, you know, we can get we don't want to be putting out the message that, you know, just give us the training and we'll do all this extra work that no time is provided for. That won't work, because we just don't actually physically have the time to do it. So I think when we're emphasizing training, it has to be, even more importantly, we need to emphasize the time. That's the first thing. Also, there's a lot of emphasis recently on inclusive education and about bringing people into the system and including people in the system. And of course, we support that. But I think we need to be careful that we don't obscure the fact that a lot of social exclusion starts outside the school in the first instance. And Susie mentioned homelessness in the first place already. She mentioned homelessness. And then if you think of the fact on how social class influences the extent to which people progress to third level. So for example, we saw figures in 2014 that only 15% of students from Dublin 17, that's Coolock and Darndale, progressed to third level, and 16% from Dublin 10, that's Ballyfermot and Cherry Orchard, progressed to college. And that compares with 99% of students from Dublin 6. So there are clear social and class inequalities that exist outside the education system. And that's in spite of the positives that Moira Leydon mentioned about inclusiveness and the statistics and so on, that's still a reality that the education system, it's difficult for the education system to address that by itself. It's a political project as well, because you need a more equal society to have, to some degree, to support a more equal education system. And the education system and teachers can only do so much. And it was already mentioned that we have the lowest funding in the OECD out of 35 countries. I mean, we're literally operating on a shoestring, and now we're expected to bridge the gap to bridge the disadvantage gap with no funding. While the government talks about inclusiveness in schools, it obscures the fact that it's doing very little outside schools to deal with the inequality in society, which then feeds into the education system. So it's not just an educational project dealing with educational disadvantage, it's a political project as well, and we should be fully involved in that aspect of it as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you very much for keeping within our time limits. We really appreciate that. Fergal Canton from CEC, Kilkenny. Fergal, would you come in, please? Will the Kilkenny spokesperson join us? We're looking forward to your contribution. Fergal, have you unmuted yourself and your
I have
video?
unmuted myself. I'm trying to get access now. I just want to speak on the e-learning and
Okay,
start video. Okay, we're all struggling with this. Thank you. I just wanted to mention that going back to the IT 2000 plan, there was a very far-seeing move to bring e-learning culture into the schools. And in relation to the education report, the equipping of schools with a culture of e-learning was very important. There was a roadmap for e-learning issued to all schools, and Jerome Morrissey and the excellent people in the NCTE, the National Centre for Technology and Education, were providing great leadership and I would say dynamism. When we were closed at in March and teachers were thrown back to their own resources, I became very aware that the NCTE, the National Centre for Technology and Education, had been folded into the NCCA as an austerity move. And that was regrettable. And so I would recommend to the Education Committee to look to the government to restore the National Centre for Technology and Education and the funding for training, technology and software platforms to equip our schools in the planning for the return of a second wave. It was a huge resource, and it was, I suppose, de-emphasized as a result of austerity, and it's something that we as teachers need again and need a restored emphasis on. So I just call for us as a trade union to look to the NCCA and to the Minister to restore the National Centre for Technology and Education and to refund and galvanise the efforts and work of forwarding an e-learning culture, which will not only benefit all teachers, but also our students and schools as well. Thank you.
Fergal, for your contribution. Now we have one question and Moira is going to take it. It's from John Kennelly in Clare, and that is, John would like to know what happened to the longitudinal study which was agreed as part of the junior cycle implementation. Thank you, John.
Good afternoon again, Convention. Yes, John, I think I may have mentioned that in my opening remarks on the Education Committee under curriculum. As you know, this was one of the key demands and it was a very political demand that the ASTI had, which we managed to get into the joint statement of principles and time for the junior cycle framework in May 2015. Very much the ASTI felt that one of the many reasons why teachers were deeply uncomfortable and in effect the ASTI members rejected the framework was that they felt that they had been haphazardly implemented and that the process of change was rushed, was under-supported and wasn't based really on where teachers were at in terms of their vision and values for education and the way they understood the curriculum. So when the ASTI, in those very drawn out talks, as any of you who would have been involved at the time would be aware of how drawn out they were and how much CEC was aware of the nature of that drawing out, one of the key demands that the ASTI had in that was that we must do a longitudinal study of the implementation of the junior cycle. In effect, something perhaps even parallel to the work that the ESRI did in advance of the changes to the junior cycle. As you know, the ESRI looked at first, second and third year, fifth and sixth year, and 1 year out of school to lay the groundwork for change at the junior cycle. And we very much felt that we need to do a similar type of extensive and deep investigation on the implementation of the junior cycle in the school system. Unfortunately, we fought very hard for that. We raised it at every single meeting of the junior cycle implementation group. We raised it, it was referenced at CEC, it was debated at convention. We continue to raise it. Our very able representatives on the NCCA Council raised it repeatedly. But I regret to say that the NCCA Council decided that it would not engage in a longitudinal study, that it were engaged to what in effect will now be a post implementation study of the way the junior cycle has been implemented in schools. The tender, my understanding is that the tender the tender was being issued and developed for that process, to get an external company to come and do that post implementation study. It's my understanding that the NCCA received a number of tenders to that effect, but I think due to the COVID crisis and due to the fact that very, very few meetings of the NCCA Council took place this year, I understand a decision has not yet been taken. But John, to come back and to paraphrase, unfortunately, we didn't get what we fought very, very strenuously for, a longitudinal study. Rather, we're getting a post-implementation study. However, I don't think, and I don't think Standing Committee believes it either, that doesn't invalidate the importance of conducting such a study. Because one of the really big issues, which we'll be talking about later, is the whole, shall we say, haphazard nature of the implementation of curriculum and policy change. Thank you, President.
Thank you, Maura. And Miriam Duggan is going to come in and speak to the education report. So Miriam, if you would join us, please.
Thank you very much, President. Can you hear me?
Yes, Miriam, we can.
That's great. Okay, thank you very much. I just would like to echo Mark's comments about the importance of not using the education system to resolve political issues. And there is a huge problem that needs to be solved in terms of societal equality. And we can help, but we can't be the key people to do it. So that I'd like to absolutely echo that. I'd just like to raise one issue with CPD, with ICT, I should say. We do need training in this. And yeah, it's become very, very obvious. Our students also need training in terms of this. But my point is that we must make sure that whatever CPD is given is worthwhile. This cannot be a tick box exercise. And I just want to emphasize the importance that one morning rushed in a school does not an expert make. And we've all been through CPD where the box got ticked and we were told we were doing fine. And then you're thrown back into the classroom trying to deal with issues. This issue has to be dealt with properly. So the quality of CPD has to be an issue, as well as the fact that we need it. Thank you very much, President.
Thank you, Miriam, and thank you for your focus and brevity. It's much appreciated. Now we have one more question, and then we are moving on to the senior cycle review report. The question is from Nora Martin, and it is: a new leaving certificate economics specification was introduced last year, 2019-2020. There is new research study project to be completed in the next academic year between September and Christmas. Have we any information on whether this element is proceeding given the changed circumstances? And the BSTAI Subject Association has made a request to the SEC that it be postponed this year. Maura, would you like to come in on that, please?
I'll be brief for a change, President. No, we don't have any information, Nora, I'm afraid. And I know you're very deep engagement with the BSTAI over the years. However, I'm very aware that as part of the guidance which issued to schools next week in terms of reopening, there will be very, very specific guidance around how we can not narrow the curriculum, but how we can, shall we say, stall the introduction of some additional new or additional elements with the view to giving the time and space to teachers and students to make up for lost time. So at the moment, no, but I imagine the guidance that issues next week will address not just that subject, but there are other subjects as well which have this second component assessment, which are in the dark at the moment. So that's the situation at present, President.
Thank you very much, Maura. And are you going to move on, Maura?
Yeah, indeed. And thank you, Convention, for delegates for bearing with me. You're hearing a lot of me this morning. My apologies for that. So we're moving on now to the senior cycle. When the President and the General Secretary and the officers were finalising the agenda for today's remote conference, it was felt that it was very important that we would use the space for education to, I suppose, update delegates and update all of our members, and indeed others who are listening and looking at us being live streamed, as to what is happening with the senior cycle review. Anne Loughnane, the chairperson of the Education Committee, in her opening remarks made the very, I'm not sure if it was a metaphor, but she made I think perhaps it is a metaphor, she made the very appropriate metaphor to the effect that the senior cycle is like a juggernaut coming down the tracks. And she's absolutely right. It's unstoppable. I think that's the point Anne was trying to make. The senior cycle change, many analysis are saying it actually will be accelerated by the experience of the last number of months. Whatever the situation, I think we all need to be absolutely alert and vigilant as to what are the changes that the ASTI thinks are legitimate and capable of being implemented, and also what are the changes which we feel don't meet teachers' requirements, and indeed the requirements of students and the values that teachers bring to their work. So what I want to do, President, is to give an overview, without commentary, give an overview of where this journey started off, where we're at now, and what are the issues which are going to be posed and posited in the coming months, because we are privy to the work that's going on, obviously, at the NCCA, and we know that the work has been advanced. So, President, I'll give a chronological overview first, and then tell delegates and where we're at. So this process commenced in, I suppose it was around the academic year 2016-2017. The NCCA Council was directed by the Minister to look at senior cycle. Very interestingly, the language was not a reform of senior cycle, rather it was to review the senior cycle curriculum. The last time the senior cycle curriculum had been reviewed was in 2006 under the, I suppose you could call it, stewardship of the then Minister for Education, Minister Mary Hanafin. So in 2016-2017, the NCCA engaged in commencing a discussion around senior cycle review and commissioned international research, which looked at 9 jurisdictions and how they did senior cycle across a number of dimensions: the curriculum content, the model of assessment, the model of, shall we say, recording the achievement at the end of that period, and where senior cycle led to. Did it lead to third level destinations? Did it lead to further education and training, or to work, or whatever? So there were quite comprehensive desktop reviews. And then there was a national conference in Croke Park, which many of you would have been aware, would have participated in as members of NCCA committees, etc. And of course our officers and officials and members, ASTI representatives on council, would have been at that event. And then we had 2017-2018, an extraordinarily rushed process whereby the NCCA nominated 41 network schools whose job it was to engage in internal discussion around 2 dimensions of change at senior cycle. And by internal discussion, I mean students, teachers, and parents. Schools were facilitated to have these discussions, which were documented, written up, reproduced, and used as the evidence base for the NCCA Council in the next stage. So there was 41 network schools. They were required to, in the first term, look at the purposes and vision for senior cycle and engage the 3 stakeholders around that discussion. In the second term, the focus of the discussions was on curriculum, content, and pathways. And really, that has the discussion on senior cycle in very many ways has been, shall we say, framed, I wouldn't say reduced, but framed by those 2 headings. So we had the 41 network schools. At the end of the first term, when we looked at vision and purpose, there was 4 regional seminars held all around the country by the NCCA to disseminate the views, the findings, etc., supported by ESRI research. Very many ASTI representatives took place in those seminars, including I would say most of Standing Committee and many members of CEC. The same process happened at the end of the second round of discussion, another 4 seminars, and the ASTI really had an enormous presence and profile at these events because we felt there was one dimension lacking in all of the reports that were emanating from the ESRI and the NCCA. And that dimension that was lacking was the voice of the teacher. What was paramount in the discussion was the student's voice, but what was utterly absent was the teacher's voice. And the ASTI was absolutely indignant at this, and we communicated that to the highest level, that this was a serious political mistake. And in fact, one of the profound lessons that we learned during the junior cycle was that teachers, and to paraphrase, not to paraphrase, indeed, to quote him directly, Dr. Porrick Travers, when he was writing, shall we say, the background report to the escalating dispute around 2014 around the junior cycle. He made the point that teachers felt deeply alienated by the process of change that was taking place around the junior cycle. And I think the ASTI Standing Committee were absolutely vigilant in terms of that process of teachers feeling deeply alienated was almost capable of happening again, all over again with the senior cycle. So we had a very, very high level of engagement, and I want to give tribute indeed to all of our former presidents and indeed our current president, who were really active and went around the country and made very strong presentations on your behalf and on behalf of the teacher voice at all of these regional seminars. So then at the end of 2018, there was another national conference in Croke Park whereby the ESRI report and the NCCA reports were disseminated, etc. So then what happened, and I think it's important to get the chronology because this is moving very, very quickly, was in 2019, in September, over this, I think it was May to October 2019, the NCCA published a draft consultative document. It published a public consultative document as part of the preparation of the advisory report to the Minister. And needless to say, the ASTI Education Committee and the ASTI Education Committee and Standing Committee co-created, so to speak, a very robust and a very comprehensive submission to the NCCA. And Bernadine, if we move on perhaps to the next slide, please, the ASTI response. Thank you. So, so in our submission to that national consultation in September 2019, you can see the key points that we emphasised. Chief among them was the need to retain the Leaving Certificate examination as an external examination as the key mode of assessment of the end of second level learning. We emphasised its high social trust. We emphasised its efficacy in terms of being able to translate broad statements of student achievement into the employers understood it, the third level education system understood it, society understood what the grades and standards meant, and more importantly, students themselves were very, very aware of what the achievement in the Leaving Cert signified for their own effort, their own abilities, their own commitment, and for what it meant for them in terms of moving on from school to different destinations. So it was absolutely, we really got it in there really strong about the need to retain the Leaving Cert with second component assessment also externally assessed. So I don't think it's ever fair to say that the ASTI has a complete shall we say, focus exclusively on the terminal written exam. Our policy since 1992 has always advocated the need for complementary, externally assessed second component assessment. So the other key area we were very concerned about in the NCCA's draft document was the idea that the transition year could have almost a dual status. On the one hand, it could remain as a standalone year, which the school would have, the way we currently understand it, an optional, for most students, an optional year at third year, then you move on to fifth or sixth year. The NCCA document suggested that schools could also opt to have elements of the transition year incorporated into the Leaving Certificate programs. And the Standing Committee was very much of the view that the value of the transition year was such that it would be diluted and diminished and to a certain extent devalued if it became a kind of an optional modular type of program, which really didn't have a distinct ethos and status. The other area, of course, which our submission highlighted very much so, was the whole area of capacity issues, the implementation process. And I should say that unusually, the NCCA and the Department of Education invited the OECD new policy section on how to implement education policy. It invited the OECD team to come and visit the NCCA and to visit the various education stakeholders. We have not seen the OECD report yet, but we are aware of its broad focus, which is the need to address capacity issues as part of any implementation strategy. Again, we emphasize the need to research on the framework, the junior cycle framework, in advance of any implementation of change at senior cycle. We emphasize the need to deepen consultation, to create the much vaunted shared vision of what senior cycle should be. And finally, we reiterated in our submission the need for teacher voices to be central to the entire change process. As part of the ASTI's response, we commissioned research from the academic Dr. Brian Fleming, and his research was titled Making, I understand delegates that the screen may have disappeared, but I will keep talking. Oh, it's okay, fine. We commissioned Dr. Brian Fleming to conduct some research on our behalf as regards making education policy work. And indeed, that was the title of his paper, which is on our website, and you will have seen it, very many delegates. Dr. Fleming's excellent comprehensive critique of education policy mirrored many of the concerns that we had expressed. In other words, policy making is a process, it's not a product. One of the problems with the way we've done curriculum change is we design a fabulous curriculum, and we say to the teachers now, there you go, off, implement it, unpick it, match learning outcomes with key skills, with the statements of learning, and do it. Curriculum is not that. Curriculum is very much what happens between the teacher and the student within the framework of a curriculum in the classroom. So one of the key points that Brian Fleming was making is that it is erroneous in the extreme to look at policy making as getting a product rather than as a process where you generate knowledge, you generate consensus, you generate confidence, and you generate an enthusiasm about the change. In other words, we need an implementation strategy in parallel as well. He made the very, I think, subtle and important point. We need to pay close attention to context. One of the things that the ASTI has frequently complained, in the very best sense of the word, about has been the fact that very often the NCCA and other education voices talk about, well, look, this happens in other countries, and why can't you do this? It only happens sometimes 50 miles up the road in Uri, for example, models of assessment, whatever. But Dr. Fleming made the very important point. We need to pay close attention to the context within which teachers work and within which Irish schools operate, and also the public perception of Irish schools and the value of what they contribute to society. And that, I think, was a very, very key point. He also made the point in his work, which I think the ASTI, we have used this phrase, and no, we haven't just used the phrase, we have actually politicized the phrase, is the whole intensification of teachers' work in recent years. Everybody knows the phrase curriculum overload. The workload of teachers has intensified, I think, beyond sustainability at this stage. In the past, delegates at convention, we did, I think 2 years ago, we did a research study on teachers' workload. Teachers on average are working 46.4 hours per week. And much of that additional 22 plus hours that you are doing is down to classroom preparation for your teaching. So teaching is an extraordinarily labor-intensive activity, and you need time to do it properly. You are not getting the time within your working day. You are having to do it outside of the school day. And this is an intensification of your work, which is becoming unsustainable. And that was one of the very core points that Dr. Fleming made. I'm conscious of time, President, so I'll skip through this. I have about 2 more slides to go. You can see the other points that Dr. Fleming made in his analysis and critique of making education policy work. And I think the one that certainly rings a bell with a lot of us, and certainly rings a bell with Standing Committee, is that we know in the Irish context, and if we look across some waters, it doesn't work very well. Incremental change rather than radical change is what works best in Ireland, because the teachers will have the opportunity to make sure that their voice is central to that change. So where are we at now, President? Next slide. Sorry, I'm giving the cue there to Bernadine, who's doing an amazing job watching all of this complex work going on here. Where are we at now, President, in terms of change, senior cycle change? At the moment, at the last meeting of the NCCA Council and Board of Studies for Senior Cycle, a draft report is in the process of preparation. 3 chapters have been created so far. Chapter 1 refers to purpose, vision and principles. Chapter 2 is titled Realising the Vision. In other words, what should the curriculum consist of? One of the key points we've made, knowledge should not be sidelined. Knowledge is core to the curriculum, central to the curriculum. So it's content, it's about pathways, what kind of choices of subject areas, knowledge areas will students have in 5th and 6th year, and indeed in transition year. And how will that knowledge build their capacity to avail of opportunities after school? So very, very complex questions around pathways. It sounds a very soft and easy word, but actually there's a lot of complexity, as we well know. And the 3rd chapter, which of course is the chapter we will all be avidly waiting on, and which the OECD report will feed into, is the whole chapter of, which is entitled Conducive Conditions for a Redeveloped Senior Cycle, which will look at the whole process of implementation. And finally, I'll just turn to my last slide now, President. So that's where we're at, but what happens next? The completion of the advisory report was originally scheduled for September, around September or so of this year. Obviously, it's not clear if that's possible or indeed if there's any will to have that at this stage, given what's happening in terms of return to school and the chaos, well, not chaos in schools, but shall we say that the deep instability and uncertainty across the whole society about how we will cope with further outbreaks of the virus. The impact of the pandemic is obviously going to change things. It's going to change things in terms of particularly in terms of curriculum and delivery and content. There's been huge global, regional and national analysis of the impact of to use the phrase, the shift to digitalization on the curriculum, and what does it mean for the future? And I think this is one area of work where the Education Committee will really have to engage with when we reassemble in late August. What actually does it mean for the future? The last thing we want, delegates, is for the global technology companies, the mega millionaires, the unaccountable corporations who have been providing the ICT services, networks, platforms, you name it, to schools and to education systems. The last thing that any trade union or teachers want is that they will set the agenda on how we move forward with the experience of the pandemic and the shift to remote teaching. So I think that's a really, really valuable piece of work for the Education Committee. And we're lucky in that our Global Trade Union Secretariat for Teachers, Education International, has done fantastic research and some fantastic academic studies of this phenomenon. And I hate to say this, but it is going to happen in Ireland if the teacher's voice is not really upfront and talking about our core voice in education and not the global corporations. So again, I've gone on a little bit, President, I do apologise, but I think there are very, very many complex issues, issues that are direct, that are immediate, and that I think delegates need to be apprised of. And of course, the Education Committee will be very much part of the response of the Union to these developments. Gormai got the Cogoil.
Maura, and this is